to make sure that humanity dominates the stars. Wait, I haven't gone that far into the book yet. Is humanity dominating? Are we on top of the food chain? Being regular people, or if ever we do end up in the 40K universe, we would probably end up with the astramilitarum or the Emperor's regular army. So why don't we check out how it would go or how they began? Because might as well, right? So
in the world of Warhammer 40K, the astramilitarum, or Imperial Guard, are the most powerful fighting force in the galaxy. And the image of millions of individual human soldiers supported by long columns of battle tanks and brutal artillery, deployed against every horror the galaxy can throw at them, is one of the key things we think of when we imagine the Imperium. So in this video...
So we can see, actually we don't even need to know much about Warhammer 40K. I mean, thanks to the clips that we'd see almost anywhere, that the main tactic of the astramilitarum is the human tidal wave, or wave, just throwing people wave after wave after wave. Beyond that, I know nothing more, but he just, Arbiter Ian just affirmed it, that yes, they just throw in millions of people at the problem. Whether it be Tyranids or Eldar, and what other horror the galaxy has to offer.
I'm going to look into the lore of the astramilitarum, their history, how they fight, how they're organized, and what a new recruit to the Imperial Guard can expect from a grueling life in the armies of the Emperor. The astramilitarum is the standing army of the Imperium of Man, a force numbering in the billions and present in every major engagement the Imperium fights. Compared to the scalpel that is the rapid reaction forces,
because it always falls to the regular army to be the first and the last line of defense. I mean, when I think about it, these guys are the icing on the cake, but the regular army's always been the bread or the meat of it.
Of the spacemarine chapters, the astramilitarum is known as the hammer of the Emperor, a ponderous, unwieldy force that may be slow to react, but when it does, comes crashing down with the weight of millions of soldiers and thousands of tons of munitions. Its arm...
Wouldn't they be the anvil? I mean, they're always there, they're always constant, and then you bring in the space marines. I don't know, semantics.
Armies include elite special units and exotic arms and armor, but its key resource is human lives, taken from every planet in the Imperium to fight and die in the name of their emperor, and spent, sometimes without a thought, by the Lord Generals and Lord High Commanders of the Imperium. The astramilitarum wins its battles by relentless pressure, as regiment after regiment is poured into a war zone, often overcoming an enemy through attrition alone, for the Imperium of 40K is never short of manpower. Though just unmodified humans armed with lasguns and clad in flak armor, soldiers of the astramilitarum are deployed against Xenos horrors, unspeakable warp entities, chaos-worshipping cults, and heretic space marines, and expected to hold their ground, their infantry platoons spurred on by skilled officers and the ever-present threat of their commissars waiting to execute any...
Skilled officers and commissars, so I'm guessing we have to know the distinction between them. Because historically speaking, commissars, or, well, political officers are supposed to keep up the quote-unquote party ideals of the fighting men. But to me, personally, I've never actually read too much into it. All I know is that political officers in every army unit, if we go back to IRL history, they're supposed to keep up the party ideals within the unit, but with regards to their actual influence or actual authority, I am not sure. But it seems like this position, every time you see one, would suck for the rest of the army.
Who turn from their holy duty. These infantry platoons are then backed by some of the heaviest arms and armor the Imperium can produce. Liman Russ and Rogaldorn battle tanks, Basilisk and
Leman
Medusa
Russ.
artillery pieces, Valkyrie gunships, and super heavies like the Baneblade and Shadow Sword, manufactured and deployed in vast columns of armor to war zones across the galaxy. These vehicles aren't the pinnacle of Imperial technology like the battle tanks or the Space Marines, but just extremely long-lived and rugged designs that can be built in huge numbers and repaired on campaign. The regiments that make up this force are drawn from across the galaxy, from the hives of Mordian and Vostroya to the death worlds of Catachan and Valhalla to the arid deserts of Talan. Organising and supplying such a force is one of the biggest logistical efforts the Imperium undertakes. The command structure of the Guard.
See, finally, we're talking logistics. Because in almost every film or television series out there, all we see is the army forming. All we see is the two armies facing off in a battlefield. And I've always thought that who's feeding all these people? Who's responsible for their maintenance? Who's responsible for their wages? In the Last Kingdom television series, which was based off of Bernard Cornwell novels, they just, show Vikings show up in the thousands. We've got like hundreds of ships filled with thousands of Viking warriors, and all I could think was, who's handling the logistics of it all? Who's responsible for their provisions? And it seems like everyone's just sleeps rough on the ground. Every night they feast and they'd sleep rough on the ground, and that was it. Who's responsible for their discipline? Who's responsible for their unit arrangements? None. But it seems like here in the Warhammer 40K universe, they've already been fleshed out, and you definitely need a budget to produce something like this, or at least to run an army like this.
Stretches all the way to the very top of the Imperial hierarchy, with no less than 3 of the 12 High Lords of Terror being responsible for it in some way. The Departamento Militarum, the organisation that exists to organise and supply all this, is a behemoth, raising, supplying and reinforcing millions of regiments across the galaxy at any one time, in an operation that occupies whole planets' worth of scribes and clerks. In the 41st millennium, the Imperial Guard is by far the biggest and most important of the Imperium's armed forces, but for many of the founding years of the Imperium, it didn't really exist. The history of the astramilitarum as an organisation starts during the Scouring, as the Imperium was reorganised in the wake of the colossal civil war that was the Horus Heresy. Unaugmented human troops had always been part of the Emperor's armies, from the earliest days during the unification of Terra to the expansion out into the galaxy known as the Great Crusade.
No, they have to be
often eclipsed in glory by genetically modified.
See, one of the biggest problems I have, especially with historical films, is that you've got like two armies standing in, or at least, forming, and all of them are wearing plate armor, doused with chainmail. In reality, you've only find like one person standing in full plate. Because showing up in full plate is the equivalent of everyone in a car show showing up in a Bugatti. Not everyone has it. That's what makes knights so special, is that they can actually afford it. Whereas medieval armies would basically be composed of the peasantry or the serfs, which would show up with whatever they have. Because in the modern time, we have uniforms, we have a budget, but back then, during the medieval era, each and every lord and knight is responsible for arming his own men. So one of my biggest problems with modern movies, especially in fantasies, is that you've got armies showing up in full plate, wearing uniformed swords, which is definitely not the case. Because you know what? Someone has to pay for it, and it seems like it's already being explained how exactly they're paying for it, or how they began to pay for it.
Soldiers, the Custodes, Thunder Warriors, and later the Space Marines of the Legiones Astartes. Together, these human forces were known as the Imperial Army, but it was actually a number of different armies, regiments, and battalions that could be incredibly diverse in their organisation and operation. The famed Old Hundred, the Terran armies that allied with and served the Emperor during the unification of Earth, comprised such famous names as the elite Lucifer Blacks, the gene-bred regiments of the Geno Chiliads, or exotic robo-cavalry like the Tupolov Lancers, each totally different in their methods and equipment. As the Crusades spread out across the galaxy and re-established contact with human worlds, even more human armies were added, levied from newly compliant worlds as they all became part of the Imperium. At this point, there was neither the infrastructure nor the time for any sort of standardization. These regiments were raised quickly.
Exactly. By the time of Imperial Rome, people have always imagined that you've got a vast army of legions wearing the same thing, holding the same weapons, doing the turtle formation. But no, actually, the Roman army was quite diverse because they were levied. They were filled up with auxiliary troops from their colonies. So they wouldn't exactly all look alike. At least only a portion of that particular army would wear the Roman red, whereas the rest would be filled up from conquered tribes and, well, allies.
And immediately assigned to expeditionary fleets, each a self-reliant army group with its own naval assets, air support, diplomats, architects, historians, and everything else required to effect compliance of a newly encountered civilization. These fleets were often led by the legions,
every fleet
like the
is
63rd Expeditionary Fleet, commanded by the War Master Horus and comprising much of the Sons of Horus Legion's strength. They were supported by the human armies of the Byzant Janizars, who were mostly relegated to garrisoning conquered worlds and mopping up pockets of resistance after the spear tip of the Legion had moved on. But the legions couldn't be everywhere, and many expeditionary fleets were just groupings of human troops with minimal Astartes support. The 670th Expeditionary Fleet, led by Lord Commander Teng Namat Jira, included regiments.
So imagine this is Roman red, while the rest are auxiliary troops provided by allied countries or conquered tribes.
From the Regnort Thorns, the Geno 5-2 Chiliad, the Zanzibari Hort, the Crescent Sin 6th Turret, and many more with extremely limited Astartes support. These combined armed self-sufficient forces were invaluable during the Crusade, but they proved to be a liability as the Horus heresy spread across the galaxy. It wasn't just the 9 traitor Space Marine legions that turned upon the Emperor, but also their attendant army units. The heresy stretched from the highest Primarch down to the lowest impressed army trooper. If a fleet commander turned to the side of Horus, he brought with him an entire mobile battle group with multiple regiments attached. And so, as the ashes of the heresy settled and the remnants of Horus's traitor forces were hounded into the Eye of Terror during the Scouring, Robert Guillermin, Primarch of the Ultramarines, enacted sweeping changes to how the Imperium's armed forces operated, so that no one commander could hold on to so much power ever again. The regular armed forces of the Imperium were split into the Imperial Navy.
Okay, we've got the Emperor, the High Lords of Terra, the Inquisition. The same level, Adeptus Mechanicus, Adeptus Terra, Adeptus Ministorum. Alright, so they've started to actually organize.
And the Imperial Guard, formerly known as the Astramilitarum, under the command of the Departamento Munitorum, which itself was a part of the new Administratum of Terra, the imperial bureaucracy. The Departamento was actually devised in the latter days of the Great Crusade in an attempt to manage the chaotic organization of the Imperial Army, but now it would be responsible for the raising, maintaining, deployment, and supply of these new regiments of the Astramilitarum. As well as this split from the fleets, the new regiments of the Astramilitarum would be divided up by role, with regiments of infantry, artillery, armor, or anything else kept separate with very limited combined arms capabilities. Any future traitors or rogue commanders would be limited not only by the sorts of troops at their disposal, they'd need multiple regiments turning to prosecute any sort of war, but also by a lack of interplanetary travel. So successful were these reforms that the system remained in place with minimal changes for 10,000 years. In the 41st millennium,
So, they organized in order to prevent another heresy, or another civil war in such a way that each and every unit would be isolated by itself? Interesting.
Every planet in the Imperium is expected to manage its own local affairs under the rule of its planetary governor, but each planet is also assigned a tithe by the Administratum, the colossal bureaucracy of the Imperium. This tithe could be anything from food destined for overpopulated hive worlds, to raw materials destined for manufactory planets or forge worlds, to industrial output, a quota of finished products, often weapons or machinery of war. But frequently, some part of the tithe is extracted in the the form of fighting warriors, regiments for the astramilitarum. In fact, on some worlds like Krieg or Cadia, fighting warriors are the main tithed element. And while
we'll be checking those two out later.
Tithes can remain the same for thousands of years, they could always be reviewed and adjusted based on local developments. Nearby Xenos activity, unrest, or new incursions might see additional demands for manpower added to a planet's tithe, but whatever the reason, as soon as a military contribution is required, it becomes the Departamento Munitorum's job to organise the raising of these new regiments, their supply, collection, and then deployment.
So they've gone back to a feudalistic style of taxation in the form of tithes. And, well, levy for men, just as it's always been. Because IRL, we have standing armies, we have the regular armies. Then, new units would be formed. Because generally how it works, IRL, is that they won't form new units. What they would do is they would simply overpower these existing units under the command of regular units. Because forming new units by itself is usually a bad idea. You've got men with no experience whatsoever, whether they be volunteers or draftees. So what they would do, especially when there's a call for volunteers, is that they would simply be provided, or they would simply be placed as replacements to the regular units, so that the veterans or the regular men would actually be there to guide them. But actually forming entirely new units simply wouldn't happen, generally, because new calls for volunteers would simply be there in order to replace the regular men that were lost. But here, they just go and form new ones based on the bureaucracy, which is wow.
To wherever they're headed. Where the manpower for these regiments comes from varies depending on the planet. Every world in the Imperium is expected to raise and maintain its own local armies, known as Planetary Defense Forces, or PDF, to keep peace, prevent rebellion, defend the planet against pirates or raiders, and form the first line of defense against, well, anything
So
bigger.
they're the regular
every
army.
planet already has some form of standing army, but the quality of that PDF can vary greatly. Hive worlds or industrial worlds like Mordian might have large and efficient PDFs, armed and equipped much like the astramilitarum itself, but a backwater farming planet might rely on a small citizen militia using ancient heirloom las rifles, and feral worlds might have warriors with an even lower technological level. Regardless, one of the most common ways of raising new Imperial Guard is to draw them from a planet's standing PDF. Imperial worlds have a responsibility to make 10% of their armed forces available for induction at any time,
regulars
with
go
often
first.
the most elite or prestigious regiments transferred into the Imperial Guard and put under the command of the Departamento. But it's equally likely that new foundings will be held as required, with the
So this is what I was talking about. There wouldn't be a uniformed guard because they're drawn from allied worlds who simply wouldn't look alike because they have different resources, different cultures, and, well, different manufacturing capacities.
Power supplied by any means necessary, from glorious founding ceremonies of new volunteers, as with the Gudronite rifles, to conscription, impression, or even the clearing out of undesirables.
Press ganging.
Though a planetary governor who chooses to fulfill his quota to the Departamento with, say, convict troops had better be pretty sure they're going to make good soldiers, lest he be considered remiss in his
Okay, so the concept of penal battalions exist in this world. Of course, with recent events and historical events, they actually made the study that penal battalions are bad for business. Unless, of course, you're just there for cannon fodder. But it's not every day you can use them for cannon fodder because according to that particular study, penal units or penal battalions tend to do bad things. They're responsible for massacres and, well, criminal activities against the local population. It doesn't even matter which side they committed against, but yeah, so they perform criminal activities, they performed poorly, they performed the worst. Unless, of course, for a country to use them would be truly desperate because, well, they're needed and you've got manpower in prisons. But yes, again, studies have shown that it's always a bad idea to use penal units or penal battalions.
Holy duty to the Imperium. Also, while some planets in the Imperium are exempt from this tithe, like Space Marine homeworlds or Adeptus Mechanicus Forge worlds, that doesn't mean they don't sometimes maintain their own.
Yeah, what are the chances that you're gonna end up in a world like that? And what exactly is their logic that if you do end up in a space marine world, what are the chances that life would actually be better living there?
Own
It's like
defense
winning the
forces
lottery.
anyway, and even occasionally send regiments to the astramilitarum. Ultramar in the Galactic East is a famously efficient example of a space marine realm and contributes regiments to the Imperial Guard, as does the Forge world of Urdesh, a linchpin of the Sabbat world's crusade. What sorts of regiments are raised when a new founding's called is determined by the Departamento, but often, like in the old Imperial Army, the particulars of the planet in question play a role in determining what sort of regiments they supply. The Hive world of Armageddon's colossal toxic ash wastes produce famed mechanized
The name of their planet is actually Armageddon.
regiments. The Tanith First and Only are peerless light infantry and scouts due to their homeworld's dense moving forests, and the system of Elysia, where the local PDF are engaged constantly against the pirates
Airborne.
lurking in their system's gas clouds and moons, produces elite airborne drop troopers. But though planets might be famous for one particular kind of regiment, that doesn't mean that's all they supply. The Death World of Katachan might be famous for its jungle fighter guerrilla infantry regiments, but it still produces
Rambo.
artillery regiments and tank regiments, and worlds like Brimlock, Krieg, or Cadia produce almost every sort of regiment known to man. The intention with this system is to make sure that any given regiment is a self-enclosed unit that's rough.
Where do we get info like this? Look at that! Oh, I wish I could find a community here. That seems far off.
Roughly the same level of military might as any other regiment, so that the Departamento can assess the threat level in a given war zone and then commit a certain number of appropriate regiments to it from nearby sources. For example, during the first Taros campaign, when the Imperium attempted to retake the desert world of Taros from the invading Tau Empire, the Lord Marshal de Stale was supplied with 10 regiments. 5 were from the desert world of Talarn, thought to be particularly suitable for the conflict.
Desert
4 infantry
warriors
regiments and 1 armoured regiment, either pulled from other duties or newly founded. The other 5 were more varied. The 23rd Elysian drop troops able to rapidly redeploy across the desert wastes, a unit of Serenian assault engineers, heavy infantry for the expected urban fighting at the end of the campaign, the mechanised 114th Cadian shock troops in their Chimera transports, the 8th Grimlock Dragoons who had recent experience fighting the Tau, and finally the 19th Krieg Armoured who were just nearby and on garrison duty and thus available for the campaign. As we said, the intention here is that each regiment is roughly equal in terms of effectiveness, but in reality, regiments can vary drastically in size and power and in organisational structure. An infantry regiment might be anywhere between a few thousand to a few 100,000 soldiers. And though they're nominally commanded by a colonel and split down into first companies and then platoons, the exact ranks used, the number and size of companies, and the adoption of...
So you've got a regiment, black, red, green platoon. Alright, that should do it. So you've got a colonel leading a regiment, which is pretty much IRL standard. Yep.
Other organisational units like battalions all depends on the regiment. One thing that is slightly more uniform is equipment. For the Departamento Militarum, supplying multiple war fronts at once, standardised weapons, armour and ammunition is a huge benefit. And new recruits, the Imperial Guard, can be expected to be issued with some form of flak armour, layers of ballistic materials that provide basic battlefield protection, and a lasgun, the most reliable and widely produced weapon in the Imperium, as well as standardised sidearms, clothing, and of course devotional texts like the Imperial Infantryman's uplifting primer. There is of course still some variation here. There are numerous different patterns of lasgun, some of which are favoured by particular worlds, but at the technical level, if something can be standardised by the Departamento, it is. The newly raised regiment will be transferred into the holds and troop. The newly raised regiment will be transferred.
Check this out. Great.
Some variation here. There are numerous.
The reason that firearms are standardized in one particular army is so that troops could actually share munitions and parts with each other. So it seems like it's pretty standardized, so they got that going for them. Yep.
Different patterns of lasgun, some of which are favoured by particular worlds, but at the technical level, if something can be standardized by the Departamento, It is.
They
The
should.
newly raised regiment will be transferred into the holds and troop bays of Imperial Navy ships, ready to begin its journey to its assigned war zone. For the individual soldiers, it's unlikely they'll ever see their home world again. All they have to look forward to is a lifetime of war in the Emperor's name and occasional stretches of drilling and training on the long journeys between conflicts.
Wait. Holy crap, you will never see home again. Because what's the standard enlistment contract? It could be from a year to 1 to 10, right? But what would be the point? What's the other option apart from enlisting? Do you like work in a factory for the rest of your life in a hive world or something?
If they ever make it past the first one. They could be assigned to a sleepy garrison post on a distant world.
Like, here's a question. You're traveling from point A to point B. After your first engagement, you lose like, 10% or 20% of your regiment. What about the replacements? Do they like catch up with you from your original world, or do you draw recruits from the newly conquered world? And what about supplies? You're gonna need supplies for these men. Who's handling the baggage train, and would it actually catch up? Imagine World A is home world. World B is the world you're going to conquer. So fine, you've just conquered World B, and now you're traveling to conquer World C. What about the replacements from... Do they draw it from World A while you're traveling to World C, which is much farther away? What about the replacements? And what about the equipment that need to be replaced? And what about, ammunition and other logistical material needed? Like fuel, food,
or into the teeth of a grueling decades-long war where the life expectancy for new arrivals is as low as 15 minutes.
hours.
In the holds of these transport ships,
minutes?
a series of endless drills and
Hours.
training exercises begins, both to hone their skills and bring them up to the standard expected of the Imperial Guard, but also to keep them occupied and minimize friction between unfamiliar regiments from different worlds cooped up together for months at a time. Watching over all this will be the officers of the Departamento Militarum itself, the commissars of the Officio Prefectus, charged with maintaining discipline in the ranks and ensuring the regiment follows its orders. Each regiment is assigned at least one commissar, often more, and they're never from the same world as the rest of the regiment. Their role is not only to deal with day-to-day discipline and morale issues, but to ensure that both the private soldiers and the officers are fulfilling their duties. How they do this varies from commissar to commissar. Some are...
So basically, commissars come from off-world, so he wouldn't have any sympathy for the men that he's going to discipline, which makes sense because historically speaking, European nobility usually made sure that their royal guards came from abroad. If I'm not mistaken, 19th century Spain, there was this unit called the Walloon Guards. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, but they were recruited from abroad. They made sure that they didn't speak the local language. So in case of an uprising or a revolt, the guards wouldn't sympathize with the local populace, and they were well fed and they were well disciplined and provided with almost everything just to make sure that when stuff goes down, they'd side with the leadership.
Are firebrands, almost preachers, encouraging the guardsmen from the front lines. Others are more like advisors and counselors to the senior staff of the regiment, but all of them have the power of life and death over any guardsman of any rank found disobeying orders, hesitating or deserting, or just being incompetent. And the commissar
Authority over any guardsman of any rank? Does that include top brass, the colonels of the regiment, the generals? So almost Inquisition level, at least to the regular army. Interesting. Because political officers have always existed in communist-based armies in our own history. And there was always this gray area as to how much authority they'd actually have. Because they're there to enforce the party ideals to the common soldiery. What of actual army officers? How far up the rank can they actually enforce the party discipline? Can they do it too? Questions? More questions?
commissariat is never above setting an encouraging example through the use of a judicious field execution. The
Oh.
ASTRA also maintains numerous specialist departments and organizations that exist outside the normal structure, often trained or supplied in collaboration with other organizations within the Imperium. The Scholastica Psychana, part of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, trains sanctioned battle psychers for use by frontline regiments, either as sanctioned weird vein psychers operating in groups to harass the enemy, or as Primaris battle psychers, advising guard commanders and fighting on the front lines. The elite Tempestus Scion Stormtroopers regiments are a blend of heavy infantry and special forces, wearing carapace armor and armed with hotshot las guns, and deployed on critical missions behind the lines or to spearhead an assault. Some line regiments maintain their own similar heavy infantry, known as Grenadiers, but the Tempestus Scions, trained from childhood in the Schola Progenium of the Adeptus Ministorum, are the best of the best. The Astramilitarum also raises regiments of abhumans, stable mutants considered acceptable for service in the Emperor's name. Hugely muscled Ogrins are recruited from feral worlds, armed with simple
Acceptable standards. I'm pretty sure they have it fleshed out.
ripper guns or brutal mauls, and assigned to back up various regiments on the line. And on the other end of the spectrum, the diminutive ratlings serve as specialist scouts or snipers able to infiltrate further inland than a regular guardsman. In addition to this, other, more specialized regiments might find themselves split up and assigned as fire support. So an infantry company might find itself going into war alongside Limanros battle tanks, scout sentinels from a recon detachment, or Hydra flak batteries assigned to it for the duration of a campaign. By the time our new infantry regiment reaches its first war zone, it might be a very different formation from the one that left its homeworld.
I have to read up on how the Lehman Russ battle tank got its name, because the name feels a little bit too normal. Lehman Russ.
A few thousand new recruits, trained for months in the bellies of the transport craft, are thrown into the front lines, barely aware of what war they're fighting, given orders by their captains and colonels, encouraged forwards by shouting commissars.
Okay, like that question before, they came from World A, they just conquered World B and World C. I mean, fine, we can recruit from World B to act as replacements for the losses we've incurred in conquering the said world. But what happens moving forward? I mean, where do they get their equipment? It's not like World B would have the same manufacturing capacity as World A. How do the supplies catch up while the ship or while the fleet is traveling from World B to World C?
Alongside monstrous Ogrins or elite stormtroopers, and supported by massed armor or artillery elements detached from other regiments. And along the line will be hundreds more unfamiliar regiments, just like them, but drawn from all the diverse
even have
worlds
redcoats
of the Imperium. Coordinating all this is a complex structure of command staff, from the generals, marshals, and lord commanders in charge of all the regiments assigned to a particular war zone, to the war masters, who have overall command of all forces assigned to a significant endeavor like a crusade. And from there to the Lord Commander's Segmentum, the Lord Ultima or Lord Solar, in charge of the military for an entire quarter of the Imperium. And above them all is the Lord Commander Militant of the Astramilitarum, one of the High Lords of Terror, in overall logistical command of every regiment fighting on every war front in the Imperium. If those regiments survive their first conflict, they'll just be redeployed again and again into war zone after war zone, a resource for the unending machine of the Imperium. Reinforcement from a regiment's homeworld is generally considered logistically impossible, so they'll just be whittled down over the years to a core of veteran troops. Below a certain strength, regiments might be combined with other understrength units, forming ad hoc companies, or
so yeah, that's what I was saying. If you came from World A, conquered World B, and on your way to World C, it will be, so they're whittled down to just a core of veterans. So that means they're going to be drawing from World B and C instead, because it would be impossible to get replacements from the original World A. And just as he said, they're never going to see home again. So what would be the point?
New regiments entirely, sometimes from the same homeworld, as in the case of the 597th Valhallan, and sometimes by specialism, as with the case of the 81st Belladon and the Tanith 1st combined to Zone after war zone, a resource for the unending machine of the Imperium. Reinforcement from a regiment's homeworld is generally considered logistically impossible, so they'll just be whittled down over the years to
logistically
a core of
impossible
veteran troops. Below a certain strength, regiments might be combined with other understrength units, forming ad hoc companies, or new regiments entirely, sometimes from the same homeworld, as in the case of the 597th Valhallan, and sometimes by specialism, as with the case of the 81st Belladon and the Tanith 1st combined to form the 81st 1st Recon during the
So they just fold units into each other by specialization or by, well, homeworld, because, well, I guess that's the point of it.
About World's Crusade. Regiments with even fewer survivors might be disbanded altogether. If they're lucky, the survivors of some great victory might be granted rights of settlement over a new imperial world. But in reality, this is so...
So they just leave him there, a newly conquered worlds. When Alexander the Great went after Darius after his conquest of Persia, they just went forward farther and farther into Asia, and some of his original veterans from Greece simply thought it was too far away to actually just head back home. So that's why he established several Alexandrias in order to settle there, where at least his supply train or his pathway back home would be secured by his veterans. So, that's actually quite normal.
Rare as to be a myth, the jaded veterans being abandoned wherever the war front happens to leave them, whether that's in the same system they were raised to.
So they see it as being abandoned. Do they see it as being abandoned? Because Alexander made sure that it was a reward. All his veterans, you get this amount of land, you get this amount of money. You'll be left with wives and children. But yeah, what's the attitude with regards to this particular system? Because you've been fighting all of your life and then you were abandoned there. Hold on.
Of settlement over a new imperial world, but in reality this is so rare as to be a myth, the jaded veterans being abandoned wherever the war front happens to leave them, whether that's in the same system they were raised to defend or light years away on the other side of the galaxy, left to their own devices to ply whatever trade they have remaining, and veteran guardsmen are an occasional sight in ports or underhives across the galaxy. The astramilitarum is the greatest war machine.
After the First World War, criminality ran rampant. That's why gangster films came out. There was the prohibition, bootlegging, and then of course there were the rise of the gangs. Because here's the thing, right? You've got young men that were drafted or volunteered for war. So what? Especially in the First World War, as early as 14. And for years, the only thing they did, or the only thing they've done, was serve in the army, either it be combat or as a support staff. And of course, most of them saw combat. So after the war, studies have shown that they felt listless. There was like a mass layoff that happened. If you guys check the documentaries with regards to the final hours or the final minutes of the First World War, there were no great cheers coming from the men. It was as if the day was simply over. It was as if they got laid off from work. So they've managed to get home. Economy was in shambles. And they didn't know any trade at all whatsoever apart from combat. Of course, those with useful skills simply went back to their old jobs if it was still there. But as for the rest of the fighting men, they honestly had nowhere else to go. So yeah, the system was definitely problematic after the wars ended, or at least, for the men left behind.
Machine humanity has ever conceived. A meat grinder designed to crush the enemies of the Imperium with overwhelming numbers, ingesting whole generations of Imperial citizens from all over the galaxy, stamping them into the most simple of molds, and throwing them into a lifetime of combat against every horror the galaxy can throw at them, armed with little more than a lasgun and their own fear of what will happen should they turn their backs. It comprises elite special forces and barely trained conscripts, colossal artillery formations and fast-moving tank battalions, drawn from a million worlds with a million cultures. But to the administrators of the Departamento Militarum,
they're just numbers.
And the Lord Generals of High Command, they're all just numbers. Resources to be spent to ensure that humanity dominates the stars in a world where the life of an individual guardsman, to quote the rulebook, will not be missed.
To make sure that humanity dominates the stars? Wait, I haven't gone that far into the book yet. Is humanity dominating? Are we on top of the food chain? Well,
Thanks for watching.
anyways, you guys, please don't forget to check out his channel and of course ours. Thank you for watching, guys. Now you all know the drill. Please like, share, and subscribe, and don't forget to hit that notification button. It would help me out greatly with the YouTube algo. Now, if you guys want me to check out other stories, please let me know in the comments. We upload on YouTube every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard, and we go live on Twitch. Please check us out at 8 p.m. every Wednesday and Sunday Eastern Standard. Now, class dismissed.